Welcome back. Okay, today's explainer is setting the stage for literally one of the most incredible, rapid transformations in modern history. We're looking at the United States during World War I. Just imagine trying to rewire an entire nation's society, economy, and military practically overnight. Sounds impossible, right? Well, that's exactly how the U.S. shifted from being a reluctant, passive observer into a definitive global powerhouse. And that brings us to the big mystery we're unpacking today. How exactly did an isolationist country with a tiny, honestly underprepared army manage to transform the globe in just 19 months of active combat? To put this into perspective, when the war kicked off in 1914, the U.S. Army was basically chilling on a peacetime footing. It was actually so small that the German army outnumbered it 20-1. No way, right? It's a staggering contrast, and the journey from that point to massive global intervention is absolutely fascinating.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's the path we're going to take today. We'll start with the initial struggle for neutrality, hit the tipping points to war, look at mobilizing the home front, selling the war to the public, and finally, wrap up with the changing face of the U.S. military.
Part 1. The struggle for neutrality. Because when the conflict first erupted over in Europe, the United States was a nation deeply divided.
Under President Woodrow Wilson, the initial U.S. stance was strict neutrality. We're talking minimal land war preparations and keeping a hands-off economy. But man, this sparked a fierce domestic debate. On one side, you had the preparedness movement. Led by heavy hitters like former President Theodore Roosevelt and Elihu Root, they argued forcefully for an immediate, strong military buildup. They basically believed economic and military muscle were absolutely crucial. But on the exact opposite end was the peace movement, championed by leaders like Jane Addams and industrialist Henry Ford, who actually financed a whole peace ship to Europe. They favored pacifistic solutions, diplomacy, and absolute non-intervention. So the U.S. wasn't just sitting quietly, it was loudly debating its own identity.
Moving into Part 2, Tipping Point to War, the End of Isolation. Let's see how this tension finally cracked and built into an unavoidable conflict.
The escalation to war was swift, and it's like a giant puzzle coming together. In 1915, the sinking of the British liner Lusitania by a German U-boat killed 128 Americans, sparking furious outrage. Next up, 1916 brings the suspected German sabotage of the Black Tom munitions depot in New Jersey. But the real turning points hit in early 1917. In January, Germany decides to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking American merchant ships. And then, shortly after, British intelligence intercepts the Zimmermann telegram. This was a secret German offer to help Mexico reclaim territory from the U.S. if they joined the war against America. Talk about a bombshell. These events brilliantly illustrate the sheer momentum that ultimately forced President Wilson's hand. And so, on April 6, 1917, Congress voted to declare war.
Part 3. Mobilizing the home front. Once war was declared, the government and economy had to shift gears at truly breakneck speed.
$33 billion. That was the staggering total cost of the war for the United States. To really wrap your head around how massive this was, $33 billion was 42 times the size of all U.S. Treasury receipts from the year prior. That is just mind-blowing. The government was entirely unprepared for this enormous economic strain.
So how in the world did the U.S. government pay this massive bill? Well, they leaned on two primary methods. First up, the relatively new income tax. In 1917, the base rate was just 2%, but by 1918, it jumped all the way to 12%, with massive surcharges of up to 65% for the wealthiest earners. The second major method was Liberty bonds. The government essentially crowdfunded the war, selling $21 billion in bonds, and they got creative with it, heavily marketing directly to the masses, using movie stars, celebrities, and thousands of public speakers to convince average families to invest their hard-earned cash into the war effort.
Part 4. Selling the war. Because, as you'll see, the government wasn't just raising money, they desperately needed to unite a divided public through propaganda and patriotism. To pull this off, President Wilson established the Committee on Public Information, or the CPI. You can think of it as the original PR campaign for a war. Led by an energetic journalist named George Creel, the CPI was the first U.S. bureau dedicated solely to propaganda. They absolutely saturated the American public with pro-war messaging. Millions of posters, movies, press releases, you name it. It was incredibly effective at fostering patriotism while at the same time suppressing the voices of those who still wanted neutrality. To give you a real feel for the rhetoric of the era, listen to this quote from trade unionist Thomas Barker in 1918. He said, "Germany may protect the laborer, but in return the German laborer must think, speak, and act as the autocratic government directs. The price paid for German efficiency, I repeat, is the soul of the German people."
This was exactly how the war was actively marketed to American laborers. They framed the conflict as a fundamental fight for freedom and the soul against autocratic efficiency. However, it's important to note this push for unity also came with an incredibly strict legal backing. Congress passed the Espionage Act in 1917 and the Sedition Act in 1918. These acts effectively outlawed any criticism of the government or the war effort. Violating these laws was no joke. It carried severe penalties of up to 20 years in prison. And, historically, the records show these laws were disproportionately enforced against immigrants and African Americans who sometimes used their status to protest their involvement in the conflict.
Part 5. A changing American military. As the force swelled to over 5 million personnel, we really started to see the new faces of war.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how women step directly into uniformed military roles. And we aren't just talking about factory assembly lines here. Over 21,000 women served as U.S. Army nurses, with many right near the battlefields. The Army Signal Corps recruited 450 bilingual women, famously known as Hello Girls, to operate crucial switchboards in France. The Navy actually admitted 13,000 women into active duty, and get this, gave them the same pay and benefits as men. Plus, the Marine Corps enlisted over 300 female reservists. We even have Myrtle Hazard making history as a telegraph operator and the very first woman to serve in the Coast Guard during the war.
During this time, we also see a stark contrast in how racial policies played out on the battlefield. The U.S. military enforced strict racial segregation. So while around 400,000 black men enlisted, most were barred from active combat by white officers. Instead, they were relegated to labor battalions, unloading ships and building roads under really harsh, segregated conditions. But in direct contrast, the French military integrated African-American combat units that were loaned to them. Famous regiments like the Harlem Hellfighters fought right on the front lines as part of French divisions, and they were even awarded the Croix de Guerre, a very high military honor, for their exceptional combat actions.
And this wartime experience had a profound societal impact. When these African American soldiers returned home, many adopted the title of the New Negro. Having experienced life in France without the strict restrictions of second-class citizenship they faced back in America, they returned with a newly sharpened political focus. It really fueled a fierce determination to fight for expanded civil rights and equality at home.
Beyond the personnel, the military was going through massive technological shifts. Mules and horses simply couldn't handle the muddy trenches of Europe, so the U.S. Army shifted aggressively to mass-produce motor vehicles. They ordered 15,000 four-wheel drive Model B trucks, and over 11,000 Nash quads were built for Allied forces. And tucked inside this massive logistical shift is just a fantastic micro-narrative. Luella Bates. She was chosen to work as a test and demonstration driver for the FWD company, becoming the very first female test truck driver.
So all of this mobilization, production, and training culminated in a massive logistical triumph. 10,000. By the summer of 1918, that is exactly how many fresh U.S. troops were arriving in France every single day. The rate just skyrocketed. It provided a massive infusion of manpower that the German army simply could not match, decisively shifting the strategic position of the Allies and boosting morale right when they needed it most.
So, what does this all mean? The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, but the changes didn't stop when the guns fell silent. Just think about the sheer speed of this transformation. How did barely 19 months of total, unprecedented mobilization permanently rewire the American economy, fundamentally alter its society, and establish its dominant role on the world stage for the rest of the 20th century? It's a profound question, and the legacy of this rapid awakening is something we are literally still feeling the effects of today. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I hope it gave you a fresh, structured look into an incredible